The helicopter settled in with a heavy thrum, its downwash driving dust into the air until the whole landing zone looked blurred and scorched. Soldiers moved quickly to clear the ramp, and most of them hardly noticed the small figure stepping out from the Chinook shadow. Zarina Kessler carried herself with a quiet steadiness, boots striking against the steel ramp, shoulders hunched beneath the awkward weight of a duffel in one hand and a long, hard case in the other. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle inside the case was longer than her torso and weighed nearly half of her own slight frame. She was barely 5'5", lean and compact, yet she carried it without complaint, without fanfare, and without any attempt to make herself appear larger than she was. Master Sergeant Thaddeus Blackwood stood at the edge of the strip with his arms folded across his chest. He had 15 years of authority etched into his posture, and his smirk was practiced, the sort that carried both confidence and dismissal in the same breath. He watched her stagger slightly when the case caught on the ramp's edge and muttered to the man beside him that this must be the general's daughter. The soldiers nearby laughed at the sight, the kind of sharp, easy laughter that grows loud in places where boredom mixes with arrogance. Weapons specialist Quentin Finch made it worse. He walked forward and reached for the case with exaggerated effort, grunting theatrically as though it might crush him. He quipped about bowling balls or fishing rods and waved his hand toward her size like a magician, revealing a trick. The laughter grew. Finch's voice carried the final barb. "That thing weighs more than half of what you weigh, sweetheart." The word landed sharp, as if her presence existed for humor rather than duty. Zarina did not look at him. She did not meet Blackwood's eyes either. Her gray gaze registered every movement without offering a single sign of irritation. She adjusted the grip on the Barrett case, shifted the duffel over her shoulder, and walked past both men without breaking stride. The case dragged slightly on the gravel before she pulled it clear again. To her, it was not a burden. It was simply what she carried. Inside the command tent, the air felt cooler but carried its own weight of noise. Captain Arwen Kelleher sat behind a tablet, reviewing her assignment packet. The file was a river of redacted lines, each one a neat rectangle of silence across the page. No prior posting. No specialization listed. Kelleher tapped her stylus once and gave the kind of half-smile reserved for inconvenient puzzles. She asked where Specialist Kessler had trained, whether she had a focus, whether she had any reason to be carrying the rifle she had dragged through the dust. Zarina responded with the same quiet composure she carried onto the ramp. "I was told all necessary information would be provided by command." "Ma'am?" Kelleher looked at her for a long moment, then handed the file back without further remark. Blackwood was instructed to see her to the barracks. That instruction carried its own undertone. Barrack space was always pressed, yet she was directed to the East Block, where solo quarters stood reserved for senior officers and operators with specific security clearances. The fact went unnoticed by most, but Blackwood frowned at the detail. He did not voice it. Instead, he led her past the rows of tents and humming generators. The dust swirled in low sheets around their boots. Voices carried from the mess hall, laughter drifting through canvas walls. Zarina walked without hesitation, her grip still fixed on the Barrett's case as if it were an ordinary bag and not the symbol of her unwelcome presence. By the time she reached her door, the strip lights above the frame flickered against the settling haze. She placed the case down with slow precision, brushed her palm against the latch, and stood still for a moment. To others, the weapon looked like an absurd choice for her frame, a mismatch that invited ridicule. To her, it was simply another extension of skill, a tool waiting for use. Around her, the base roared with noise, jokes, and casual dismissals. Within her quarters, silence waited. The first impression had already been written across the dust, yet beneath it lay the quiet truth, unacknowledged for now but steady, all the same. The mess hall carried the familiar din of metal trays, laughter, and the steady thrum of voices overlapping in waves. Soldiers sat in close clusters, trading jabs about the day's drills, their noise swelling into a rhythm of belonging. Zarina Kessler moved through the line with quiet efficiency, collecting her meal without comment. Conversations faltered briefly when she passed between tables, only to rise again in poorly concealed amusement. A few tilted their heads toward the long case she had carried earlier, smirks tugging at their faces as if the weapon itself were a punchline. She gave no reaction. She found an empty table near the edge, set her tray down with deliberate precision, and ate methodically, neither rushed nor hesitant. Her posture was calm, her gaze lowered to her food, each movement controlled. It was not defiance, it was endurance. Later, on the firing range, she was placed at the last station, known among the unit as the Rookie Lane. Crosswinds cut across the valley there, unpredictable currents that scattered rounds and humbled confident marksmen. Blackwood made the assignment with casual authority, a flick of his hand that carried more dismissal than thought. Finch leaned against the range post, watching her drag the Barrett into position. He whispered something about watching a toy collapse under recoil, his grin wide enough for the others to notice. Rhodes stood nearby, his expression less mocking but still skeptical, as if he wanted to understand her but had no proof to argue against the prevailing laughter. When her turn came, Zarina lowered herself to the mat with unhurried motions. She adjusted her bipod, aligned her scope, and let the silence settle over her. The others had already fired their sequences, rounds scattering into familiar patterns across 800 meters. She breathed slowly, thumbed her weatherproof notebook for the wind notations she had marked earlier, then sighted downrange. 5 controlled shots broke the air, each spaced by her deliberate rhythm. When the targets were checked, her group measured barely 3 inches across. Instructors would have called it a solid performance under clean conditions. Yet here in the crosswind lane, it was remarkable. Blackwood's verdict came quick and flat. Adequate. Nothing more. Finch chuckled about how luck can masquerade as skill. Rhodes watched longer, noticing the absence of wasted motion. But he said nothing. That night, her quarters held none of the noise of the mess or the range. She sat cross-legged on her bunk beneath the narrow light. The Barrett disassembled across a cloth before her. Her hands moved with calm precision, cleaning each component, inspecting every groove of metal as though the weapon carried its own silent memory. The scar above her collar caught the light briefly when she leaned forward, a reminder of something unspoken. She paused only to jot a quick figure into her weatherproof notebook, the pencil strokes sharp and neat. Outside, laughter carried faintly through the walls, men trading exaggerated tales of recoil and marksmanship. She remained inside her quiet, working until each piece of the rifle gleamed and the weapon was whole again. Her world was silence and precision. Theirs was noise and bravado. For now, only one was heard. The alarm went off without warning, a hard buzz cutting through the night and shaking the base into hurried motion. Soldiers scrambled for gear, rifles slung, boots pounding across gravel toward their assigned stations. The scenario was simple on paper. A hostile force had breached the outer perimeter, and every team was to defend, according to rotation. Zarina Kessler's name had been marked for the north bunker, an exposed concrete shell that overlooked a dry channel. She had studied its position earlier and noted the flaws in silence. The bunker faced outward but left the low riverbed uncovered, a natural approach masked by shadows and terrain. She moved there briefly, scanning its angles, then turned without hesitation and slipped away into the darkness. Minutes stretched into pressure. Simulated fire lit up the perimeter, flares throwing shadows across the valley. Within a quarter hour, the teams in their assigned positions were overrun, role players breaching with efficiency. By the time evaluators called the engagement, every squad in Blackwood's unit had been declared eliminated. Every squad except one, hidden in the dry channel. Zarina had chosen her ground, halting the entire opposing force with lines of fire they had not accounted for. The evaluators marked her as the lone survivor, her position the only one left intact. When the lights came up and the scenario ended, Blackwood found her standing calm, weapon slung, helmet under her arm. His voice carried sharp disbelief. "You were assigned to the north bunker. Why did you abandon your post?" She looked at him evenly, her words steady. The bunker was compromised from the start. The approach from the riverbed offered better coverage and fields of fire. His jaw tightened. "That is not your call to make. Specialist. You follow orders here." For the first time. Her composure faltered slightly, not in defiance, but in memory. Her hand rose unconsciously to the scar visible just above her collar, fingers brushing it for half a second before dropping back to her side. "Yes, Master Sergeant," she said quietly. Later that night, Captain Kelleher's frustration spilled across the command tent. She stood before a secure line, her tone edged with controlled irritation. "Her file is more black ink than text. I cannot lead effectively with this kind of uncertainty. Whoever approved her transfer has left us blind." The pause that followed was long, a voice on the other end replying in clipped authority. Kelleher listened, lips pressed tight, then gave a terse acknowledgement. Understood. The next day, Colonel Adira Vasilv arrived without announcement. Her presence changed the air of the base immediately. Conversations stilled, and even Blackwood straightened his posture. She met Kelleher's eye, then turned her gaze briefly toward Zarina, who stood, as she always did, quiet, unobtrusive, but unmistakably steady. The colonel's expression revealed nothing, yet the shift was felt. Authority had cracked the night before. Now, with Vasilv's arrival, the fracture widened into a question that no one could ignore. Who was Zarina Kessler? And why had she seen what no one else did? The mess hall had been cleared of its usual noise. Trays stacked away and chairs pulled into rows facing the front. Maps flickered on the projection screen, red lines tracing across mountainous terrain. Colonel Adira Vasilv stood at the center, her voice, even as she outlined the new parameters. Intelligence placed the high-value target at a compound nearly 3 kilometers from the nearest insertion point. The distance alone set off a ripple of unease. Murmurs spread across the room, soldiers trading quick glances. Everyone understood what that range meant. It was beyond doctrine, beyond the training most of them carried. Vasilv's words cut cleanly through the tension. Specialist Zarina Kessler will take point on the long-range element. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. Blackwood rose from his seat, his voice tight with controlled defiance. "With respect, Colonel, my team already has 3 qualified snipers. We do not need this." His tone sharpened on the last word, as if Kessler's presence itself was a mistake. Finch added the inevitable mockery from the back, a low chuckle that carried across the rows. "The girl with the hand cannon," he said. "She can barely carry it to the range." The colonel did not respond, but the air shifted when a figure in the doorway spoke. Chief Warrant Officer Dashiell Mercer, his reputation long established across deployments, stepped into the room. His eyes fixed on Zarina, narrowing as he caught sight of the insignia half hidden beneath her collar. His voice dropped, almost a whisper, but every ear caught it. "That is a Zulu badge." The room froze. Conversations died instantly. Mercer moved closer, his gaze locked on her. "There are only 8 alive authorized to wear that insignia." His tone carried no doubt, no hesitation. "Hers reads 3,200 meters. Disbelief spread through the room, eyes darting from Mercer back to Zarina. Rhodes leaned forward slightly, his expression caught between shock and curiosity. Someone muttered, "What is a Zulu badge?" Mercer answered without looking away from her. "It is awarded for confirmed kills beyond 3,000 meters. His pause hung in the air, nearly impossible. For the first time since her arrival, Zarina spoke into the silence, her voice quiet but steady. 3,241 meters. Through a sandstorm. One shot. Her words landed with the weight of fact. Nothing more. Nothing less. The room absorbed it, the laughter gone, replaced by stunned stillness. Finch's smirk faltered. Blackwood's protest thinned into silence. Even Captain Kelleher's pen stopped moving across her tablet. The colonel gave no flourish, no explanation. She simply nodded toward the map and resumed outlining the mission. Yet nothing returned to what it had been moments earlier. The shift was visible in every face, in the way heads turned toward Zarina with new eyes. The badge under her collar, once overlooked, had broken the silence. Recognition had come, not from her demand for it, but from the weight of what she had already done. The ridge was still in shadow when they reached their position, the horizon only beginning to glow with the pale light of dawn. Frost clung to the grass, and the wind pressed in cold bursts across the stone ledge. Zarina Kessler knelt without hurry. Lowering her pack, with the same measured calm she brought to everything. She laid out her equipment in a precise order. Her weatherproof notebook balanced on one side, the Barrett's components aligned on the other. Blackwood settled beside her, scanning the valley through his rangefinder. He had thought her too small for the weapon, too fragile for the demands of a mountain overwatch. But as he watched her work, the impression cracked. Her motions were not hesitant. They were deliberate, efficient, free of wasted movement. She flipped open the notebook, its pages worn soft from years of use. Blackwood leaned slightly, catching a glimpse of the handwritten formulas and neat diagrams layered across every inch. They were nothing like the standard sniper manuals. Equations scrolled across the margins, annotated wind models, sketches of thermal pockets and valley currents. It looked less like a soldier's log and more like the notebooks of an engineer. She tapped her pencil against the page, muttering wind correction numbers under her breath. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked finally, unable to keep the doubt from his voice. She did not look up. "My father was a physicist. He taught me to see ballistics as mathematics. By the time I was 15, I was calculating drift and turbulence no one else bothered to notice." Blackwood studied her profile, the scar at her collar catching the new light. "And Kandahar," he said quietly. "The shot Mercer mentioned." She paused, her hand resting on the pencil. "We had been hunting a bomb maker for months. My team was ambushed. 3 killed instantly, 2 more too wounded to move." She touched the scar lightly, her eyes still on the page. "I was the only one left mobile. Command ordered extraction, but he had his location. 3,241 meters, a sandstorm closing fast. They gave me permission to take the shot." Her voice stayed flat, but the weight beneath it carried through the cold air. Blackwood shifted his rangefinder, looking down toward the valley. Most men would have broken under that pressure, he thought. She had not. He glanced back at her notebook, realizing that every careful calculation was more than habit. It was survival. What the others dismissed as overthinking was the discipline that had kept her alive when her team had been wiped away. The wind shifted, brushing across the ridge in uneven bursts. Zarina raised her small handheld meter, logged the gusts, and added notes to the margin. "The bullet will cross 3 wind bands," she said softly. "Valley currents will corkscrew. If I use the standard tables, the shot will drift wide." Blackwood frowned. "That is not in the manuals." She turned one page, showing equations that curved like rivers across the paper. Manuals simplify. Reality does not. He watched her for a long moment, seeing not fragility but a soldier shaped by loss and precision. She was not guessing. She was building certainty from chaos, turning wind and pressure into math. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not empty. It carried memory, grief, and the quiet endurance of someone who had faced the impossible before. As the first line of sunlight crested the ridge, she closed the notebook and slid it back into her vest. Her hands returned to the Barrett, assembling it piece by piece with the calm of ritual. Blackwood realized then that she was not preparing for an extraordinary shot. She was doing what she always did, what had kept her alive when everyone else had fallen. The hours bled together as the sun climbed higher, light turning the valley below into a shimmering plain of dust and shadow. Zarina Kessler lay prone behind the Barrett, body pressed flat to the earth, every line of her posture trained for patience. Blackwood shifted occasionally beside her, adjusting the rangefinder, checking wind drift with his scope. Rhodes sat just behind them with the optics kit, noting changes in air temperature and relaying numbers in a clipped voice. They spoke sparingly, each word measured, while Zarina herself said nothing. Her breathing slowed until it barely moved her shoulders. Her eyes fixed down the length of the barrel as though distance itself had narrowed into something tangible. By mid-afternoon, the first movement appeared on the southern track. Dust trails spiraled faintly upward, followed by the glint of armored glass. Rhodes confirmed the visual, his voice steady. Black SUV, 2 escorts, formation consistent. Blackwood leaned to his scope, numbers flowing from him in crisp cadence. Range 2,900 meters, adjusting to 3,000 and climbing. Winds shifting 1.5 from west. His words hung in the cold air. Data meant to anchor, not distract. Zarina marked none of them in her notebook now. Everything she needed was already in her head. The convoy slowed at the compound entrance. Doors opened. Armed guards spilled outward, securing the perimeter. The target emerged last, a figure in dark clothing, his features small but distinct through Rhodes's optics. "Confirmation complete," he murmured. 96% profile match. Green light authorized. Blackwood glanced toward Zarina, but she was already still, her breathing shallow, her body folding into the long rhythm of concentration. Time seemed to collapse. She adjusted one final mill on the elevation, the Barrett steady on its bipod, her cheek welled exact. The world around her faded into layers of silence. The laughter of the men who once mocked her, the hum of the bass, even Blackwood's voice, all of it receded until only the shot remained. She exhaled halfway, held, and pressed the trigger. The rifle thundered, its recoil absorbed into her frame with practiced ease. The muzzle blast echoed across the ridge like a rolling storm. For 4 full seconds, nothing moved but the round itself, invisible as it cut through air. It crossed 3 distinct wind bands, sliced through a corkscrew current in the valley, and rode the mathematics she had calculated hours before. Then, with a distant, flat crack, it struck. The target collapsed instantly, a clean fall against the dirt. Blackwood's voice broke the silence, hushed despite the confirmation. "Hit. Confirmed. Target down." He stared through his scope a moment longer, disbelief flickering across his face. Rhodes exhaled hard, but neither of them spoke further. They both turned to Zarina. She was already moving. Without expression, she worked the Barrett's bolt, cleared the chamber, and began breaking the rifle down into its components. Each action was calm, precise, methodical, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The valley remained quiet, the convoy frozen in chaos, shouts echoing faintly against the walls. But on the ridge there was no celebration, no cheer, no raised voices. The proof had spoken through the thunder of the Barrett, and now silence returned. Blackwood lowered his scope slowly, the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing against him. The shot itself had become the statement. Zarina Kessler needed no words. The helicopter's rotors pounded the air as it settled back onto the pad at Fob Obsidian, dust lifting in a low curtain that clung to every figure stepping off. Zarina Kessler descended last, Barrett case balanced against her shoulder, expression unchanged from when she had left. Soldiers moved across the tarmac with their usual efficiency, yet the atmosphere felt different. Where once there had been smirks and muttered jokes, now there were nods, brief and wordless. No one offered applause or cheers, but the silence itself carried recognition. Even Finch, standing near the refuel line, gave a short glance and said nothing, mocking. His eyes met hers for a second before he muttered to Blackwood that maybe the Barrett had found its rightful hands after all. Inside the command tent, the debrief ran quickly. Data confirmed the strike. Intelligence verified the elimination. Captain Kelleher dismissed the others before gesturing for Zarina to stay. When the tent was empty, she set down her tablet and spoke with a tone stripped of formality. "I owe you an apology." Zarina shook her head, but Kelleher continued, "I failed to create an environment of respect, regardless of what was or wasn't in your file. You had already earned it." Zarina's reply was quiet. "Respect matters most when it is earned, not demanded." Kelleher nodded, conceding the point, before adding only that whatever she needed for future operations would be supported. That evening, her quarters were as spare as ever, the air carrying the hum of generators through thin walls. She set the Barrett on her bunk and began the careful ritual of disassembly. Each piece laid out on the cloth, each component cleaned with exacting attention. Her hands moved with the steadiness of someone who had done this countless times before. Yet tonight there was a different weight in the silence. When she leaned forward, the scar at her collar caught the light, a reminder of what had been lost and why precision mattered more than recognition. She paused briefly, opening her footlocker to retrieve the small photograph tucked inside. It showed her and her father at a shooting range, his hand resting on her shoulder, both smiling faintly beneath a sky now long gone. She studied it in the dim light before returning it carefully to its place. The knock at her door came softly. Rhodes stood there with 2 cups of coffee, his expression neutral but carrying the faintest trace of warmth. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering one forward. She accepted, the steam curling in the cool air. "The team is gathering in the rec room. You should come." In the past, she would have declined without hesitation, retreating back into solitude. This time she met his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be there shortly." Rhodes gave a simple nod in return and left her to finish the rifle's reassembly. She lingered in the silence a moment longer, hands brushing the weapon's cool metal before setting it back into its case. The respect she had earned was not loud, not celebrated, but it had taken root, and in the quiet acceptance of nods, an apology, and a shared cup of coffee, the fracture between her and the others had begun to mend. The weeks that followed carried a different rhythm at FOB Obsidian, where Zarina Kessler once sat alone at the edge of the mess or cleaned her rifle in silence. She now found herself at the range with a circle of operators gathered around her. It was not formal instruction, not yet. A length of chalk dragged across a board propped against a crate, her weatherproof notebook lying open beside her, pages scrawled with diagrams and wind models that looked more like physics than doctrine. Rhodes listened intently, nodding as she explained how currents in a valley acted less like lines and more like rivers colliding. Blackwood, once her fiercest critic, leaned forward on his elbows, the skepticism gone from his eyes. Even Finch lingered, quiet for once, following the numbers she drew into the dust with the butt of a cartridge. Mercer stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the exchange. He saw in her lessons something more than skill. He saw continuity, the rare passage of knowledge too complex for manuals, carried instead by memory and discipline. When she spoke of mapping wind in 3 dimensions, his gaze shifted to the badge tucked under her collar. The Zulu insignia was still worn discreetly, never displayed with pride, yet everyone knew now what it meant. In its quiet presence, the unit found proof that her voice was not theory, but experience, carved from survival. Colonel Vasilv joined one afternoon, standing in the shade of the range shelter. When the session ended, she approached Zarina directly. "Command wants to formalize this," she said, her tone steady. 6-week rotations, cross-unit instruction. Your father's methods deserve to live beyond the few who understand them. Zarina hesitated, glancing at her notebook. Teaching was not what she had sought, yet she recognized the truth in the offer. This was not about recognition. It was about ensuring that what she carried would not vanish in silence. She gave a single nod. "I'll do it." That night, on the observation deck, she stood with Rhodes, the mountains stretching into shadow. The air was thin, the sky washed with stars. He asked her what her father had believed most about marksmanship, beyond the formulas. Zarina rested her hands on the railing, the badge pressing faintly under her collar. He said courage was the most important calculation, the courage to attempt what others call impossible. She spoke softly, almost to herself. Fear draws the boundaries. We erase them by trying. Rhodes looked at her, understanding the weight of those words. They were not just instruction. They were a legacy, taking root, one that would echo long after the shot in Kandahar was reduced to a line in a hidden file. Zarina did not smile, but her silence carried something warmer now, something enduring.